What you know, Alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. It is Wednesday, August 20th. Feels good to be halfway through the week, and we are closer to openings in the Donna Adelson trial. Just today, they got their 110 potential jurors. At 11 a.m. tomorrow, they'll bring them back. They will do their individual voir dire. And then they will go back and do strikes. So could we have openings tomorrow afternoon? I guess it's possible. If we don't, it looks like Friday is going to be the day, finally, the trial for Donna Adelson kicks off. I'm going to have to break this last episode down into two parts because it's really hard for me to upload something that's really over 40 minutes to YouTube. The second episode will not be quite as long. A lot of this stuff that I don't cover is going to come out in trial, but I do have an entire playlist on this case. I'm going to link that in the description. You can go through those and see if there's something specific you want to learn more about. I go pretty in depth with every episode. And then also, I'm going to link the wiretap calls between Donna and Charlie. There's some there with Katie as well. And if you do listen to those, I'm showing you on the screen here. But in that playlist, scroll down to where it says enhanced audio. What I did is I went back, improved the audio where you could hear the vocals better, and also took out the background noise and put some subtitles on there. So you can check those out if you want. I went back to Wendy's ex-boyfriend's testimony, Jeff Lacasse. He goes through their breakup at the end of June 2014 and said he had a conversation with Wendi on July 13th, 2014, which is just 5 days before Dan was murdered. He said Wendi had just returned from being in South Florida for 2 weeks, and they were talking about their relationship. He said Wendi had a habit of just blurting things out. He said Wendi asked if she could tell him something confidential, and then she said that last summer in 2013, when the relocation got denied, her brother Charlie looked at various ways to fix the situation with Dan, and one of those was he had looked into hiring a hitman. Now, Jeff wasn't sure if Wendi said it would cost either $15,000 or $50,000, but he said it was a very chilling statement. He said the hitman was mentioned specifically in response to Wendi losing her motion to relocate, and that denial was what led Charlie to look into hiring a hitman. In that same conversation, according to Jeff, Wendi told him if something ever happened to Dan, then she would be able to move back to Miami. I'll also say, Jeff Lacasse, when he was talking to police, he pegged it from day one. He said if there's anybody you need to look into Charlie, and he was right. And one more thing that I want to discuss before we get into the day Dan was murdered. This comes into play. At some point before Dan was killed, Charlie had told someone it would be cheaper to buy Wendi a TV than to hire a hitman. Well, he bought her a TV. Fast forward to when Wendi was dating Jeff Lacasse, he had grown very close to the boys and had gone over to Wendi's house one night for a movie night. He estimated this was between June 11th and June 18th. When he got there, Wendi asked him to look at the TV because she said something was wrong with it. So when he turned it on, he realized it had been struck with an object and it was basically unusable. He said to him it looked like somebody stood in front of it and just struck it with their fist. There was an impact crater and the picture was pixelated and distorted and it was really unwatchable. He said at first he thought maybe one of the boys hit it with something, but then he realized they're really small and whatever broke the TV had to be kind of heavy. Now, there was another TV in the back that he used to watch TV with the boys previously, so he went back there to hook up a DVD player in the back room, but Wendi said it wouldn't work, and she stopped him. He thought it was bizarre, but they ended up watching TV on the broken TV. He said it worked enough to know what was happening, but the boys were whining and crying the whole time, and it was very frustrating. He told Wendi that since it's not covered by warranty, let me go buy you a new one. He said he offered several times and she said no. He said it wasn't a fancy or expensive TV, but they kept watching TV over time on the broken one. For Wendi, she testified the morning of Dan's murder that she was home working on some writings and waiting on the Geek Squad to come fix that broken TV. At trial, she was asked if she made that appointment herself, and she said she did. But the prosecutor said, did your mom do it? Wendi said she didn't think so. The the prosecutor's like, here, let's look at some text messages, shall we? So they hand her some papers, and the prosecution says your mom indicates she is sending the repairman. Wendi disagreed and said she was the one that got called by Best Buy. Wendi said there was a different number on the account, so maybe they called my mom, and she said, nah, you need to call my daughter. The prosecution points out that Donna indicated she was sending the repair guy. Wendi said that wasn't anything her mom would normally do, but says it is possible that Donna was trying to help Wendi out. But Wendi distinctly remembers setting up the appointment and said that the window for them to arrive was between 8 a.m. and noon. To which the prosecutor asked, was Dan shot between 8 and noon? Wendi didn't remember, but the prosecution said he was shot between 8 and noon. Wendi doesn't remember what time and says maybe she thought it was around 11, and the prosecutor's like, so between 8 and noon? And Wendi says yes. But Wendi says the repair guy got there earlier, maybe around 9 a.m. Wendi was asked if she deleted the entry on her computer for that appointment. Wendi says she has OCD, so when she has a meeting, she will delete it. She must have deleted the repair appointment sometime after the Geek Squad came. Wendi said she had to make the call of was it worth it to get the TV fixed or just buy a new one because the repair costs were expensive. She said the TV was just a couple of years old, and according to Wendi, one of the kids threw something at it and it cracked. Not to mention, y'all, even in 2014, TVs were not expensive. I don't think I've called a repair guy in 15 years. I just go buy a new one when it breaks, and I certainly wouldn't let my kids watch a broken TV, but that's just me. Leading up to the murder, Rivera testified that ultimately Sigfredo called and said he needed to finish the job. On July 15th, Garcia gives Rivera $300 and Rivera goes to rent the Prius. So on July 17th, 2014, police say that they arrived in Tallahassee just after midnight, and that's according to cell phone records. Cell phone records also showed that their car was in the vicinity of Dan's home. On that second trip, Sigfredo had around $2,000 cash, and he gave Rivera $200 of that. And Sigfredo ran out of money, so Rivera had to give him the $200 back. He goes on to say the day before the murder, he saw who he thought to be Wendi walking on the sidewalk with the boys near Dan's house. Rivera was driving and said she looked at the car, and then he saw from his rear view mirror that she was looking at them. At Charlie's trial, Rivera said that the lady gets on her phone after they pass. So Rivera asked Sigfredo, what's up with this lady? Why is she looking so much? Sigfredo says that's the lady with the kids. That's Wendi. The investigator asked him if Sigfredo already knew who Wendi was, and Rivera thought that he did. Rivera asked Sigfredo, what's she doing up here? So once they made the corner, Sigfredo calls Katie, and he said, what's going on? I saw this lady up here. Now, in the interview that Rivera gave to investigators, he said Sigfredo didn't even have to say who he was talking about. Katie told Sigfredo that she's straight, she's making sure everything's fine. Make sure you get this done. At Katie's retrial, Rivera said Katie told them to get out of there because the lady just seen you. Sigfredo told him that Dan was leaving to go out of town tomorrow morning, so they have to do this tomorrow. Regarding seeing Wendi, Sigfredo told him she's just making sure everything's all right with the kids, and that she wanted to make sure that they were up there. She wants to make sure she wasn't paying them for nothing. At Charlie's trial, Prosecutor Kappelman asked Rivera if they found out Dan was leaving from a blog, and he said yes. The prosecutor asked what the blog was, and Rivera said Wendi. He really didn't seem to know what a blog was. While they were there, they were trying to get in touch with the guy who sold them the drugs on the last trip, and he wasn't answering. But they ended up and bumped into him and asked if he could get them some drugs. So the man told Rivera and Garcia to follow him. As they were driving, Sigfredo was playing with the gun, and it discharged in the Prius. The car wouldn't move, and Rivera realized they had no gas and said, how do we not have any gas? Sigfredo looked under the car and realized he hit the gas line. So they pushed the car off the road into a little parking lot, and the guy that they met up with told them to come with him to AutoZone. But Rivera said he was not leaving the car. So Sigfredo and the guy go, and when they come back, They jack up the car, and Sigfredo fixed the holes. After that, they followed the guy to a trailer park where they got cocaine, and then the guy followed them back to the hotel. Just a side note here, the rental car company did not spot the damage to the car. It wasn't until investigators tracked the car down, and at that point it had been sold. They found the defect, which confirmed Rivera's story. And if you're watching on YouTube, I have a photo of this car with the trajectory rods showing the path of the bullet. Rivera said he was a little mad that Sigfredo wanted to hang with this guy, and he said he wasn't there to make friends. That night, they chilled out in the hotel, and the guy stayed for just a little while. Rivera took a photo of an owl and posted that to Instagram. Well, Katie called Sigfredo and told him, tell Rivera to take it down. She asked Rivera why he would do that. You can't tell anyone where you're at. Rivera said that they talked on the phone all day. Why are you worried about me putting a picture on Instagram? So let's go into the very early morning hours the day of the murder and at some of the phone calls that took place. 12:01 a.m., Katie calls Sigfredo and they talk for over a minute. 12:07, Charlie calls Katie. They talk for over 7 minutes. 12:34, Katie calls Charlie. They talk for less than a minute. 1:02 a.m., Charlie calls Donna, but there's no duration listed. 1:03, Charlie calls Katie. That goes for over 20 minutes. Fast forward to the morning, 8:09 a.m., Donna calls Wendi, and the duration of that is 35 seconds. Meanwhile, at 8:50 a.m., Dan drops the boys off at preschool. And then at 9:02 a.m., Dan calls Wendi, and it's around a minute. It's a voicemail about dropping the boys off at school and tells her he was going to the gym between 9:15 and 10:30, but he told her he was happy to meet or chat with her about schooling. What it is, Wendi was trying to enroll Ben in a school, and it was not something she had conferred with Dan about. Wendi later testified she didn't listen to the voicemail. What I find funny is she made phone calls before and after Dan called her. At 9:12 a.m., Dan pulls into the parking lot of the gym. 9:12 a.m., Charlie calls Wendi for less than a minute. 9:19 a.m., Wendi calls Charlie for over 18 minutes. 9:38, Charlie calls Donna for 30 seconds. 9:58 a.m., Sigfredo's phone sends his last text, and it seems like at that point it's turned off. 9:58 a.m., Charlie calls Katie for over 6 minutes. 10:07, Katie calls Charlie for over a minute. And then a minute later, 10:08, she calls him again for 9 seconds. 10:09, Charlie calls Katie and they talk for 6 minutes. By around 10:33, Dan is leaving the gym and you see that Prius is still following him. So around 11 a.m., Dan is shot in his garage. And just before he was shot, he was on the phone with a School of Arts and Science teacher about Wendi looking to enroll the boys without his knowledge. The teacher said he and Dan spoke for several minutes when he heard Dan say, "Hold on a second, there's someone in my driveway that is unfamiliar to me." The man told police he heard a loud grunt, which did not sound good, muffled voices, and then labored breathing. He asked Dan if he was okay, but got no response. A neighbor heard the gunshot and looked towards Dan's house and saw a Prius peel away from the scene, which was a huge piece of evidence very early on. The neighbor called 911 and recounted what he heard and saw and said he was at that point in the garage with Dan. He said the driver's side window was bashed in, the car was still running, and he said Dan had blood all over his head and was unresponsive. Dan had been shot at close range in the head. His glasses lay on the garage floor, broken in half, surrounded by glass. Fast forward, 9:06 a.m., Donna calls Charlie. It was either attempted or maybe a text. 11:22, Charlie calls Donna for 7 minutes. 11:30, Charlie calls Katie for 30 seconds. 11:31, Charlie calls Katie for 5 minutes. 12:29 p.m., Sigfredo's phone is back online. They are on their way back to Miami. And at 12:30, Sigfredo calls Katie. Now, when they were leaving Tallahassee just after the murder, a city bus caught the Prius on camera. I have a video of that up on screen now. Now, when EMS arrives, Dan is still alive, so he was transported to Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. He had 2 penetrating injuries, one to the mid-forehead, which ended up towards the back of the skull, and then one to the left cheek just inferior to the orbit of the eye or the eye socket. The bullet that entered below the eye settled in the tissue just below the ear. He had swelling and bruising around both eyes and the mid-face. He was bleeding from his nose, his ears, and his eyes. They put in a breathing tube to establish an airway, and he did maintain his own blood pressure, but he did go through a full trauma evaluation and a resuscitation and was administered basic life support. He was pronounced dead just between midnight and 1 a.m. on July 19th. The medical examiner who testified at Charlie's trial said Dan had pseudo-stippling on his face due to the shattering glass when the shot was fired. He also had stippling from his glasses being hit by the bullet and explains that stippling from gunfire is smaller and regular, but he did have some gunpowder stippling, which would put that distance at an average of 18 to 24 inches away when he was shot. They notify Wendi, who was having lunch with a friend, and they ask her to come to the police station where they tell her there was a shooting at Dan's house, that he was hit, he's in the hospital, and he won't survive. She starts crying, says she doesn't understand, and asks what happened. She's questioned for hours. She has her phone taken. She's fingerprinted, photographed, swabbed for gunshot residue. And I have a full recap of her police interview in that playlist if you want to hear everything that was talked about. But a couple of things that always stood out to me about her police interview. First and foremost, she did not ask if her kids were okay. That was a big thing for me because my first thought would be, were my kids there? But she didn't. I counted at least 5 times. She said she understands why she would be considered the suspect. Another thing that stood out to me is an investigator says, let me ask you, if you found out this was someone you personally know, would it change your opinion on what should happen to that person, meaning whoever shot Dan? Wendi says, what would happen to that person? And the investigator said, for prosecution purposes. Wendi stays silent for a second. She kind of looks into the distance, and then she turns her head and says, no. Someone tried to kill my ex-husband. They should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And the investigator says, regardless of who it is? Wendi says, it would be different if I thought it was my brother, but I don't think it was my family. Anyone outside my immediate family, that's a tough one. But I don't think my immediate family did this, so if it's anybody else, yeah. The investigator said, do you think Charlie would be capable of doing something like this? And Wendi says, no, he's a joker. Very odd. So back to the hitman. Rivera can't remember if this next part is before or after they dumped the gun. He thinks maybe they had not yet. But Sigfredo calls Katie and tells her it's done and make sure you have my money. Katie says, okay, I know. All right. Rivera said he was like, how does she know it's done so fast? He said, I don't know if Wendi was still up here. I don't know what's going on. Rivera said the whole drive he was looking in his rearview mirror expecting police to find them. He said they were actually more than halfway back to Miami before they stopped to toss the gun. Rivera was going to stash it back in Miami and just bury it where nobody could find it, but Sigfredo wanted to toss it. He said Sigfredo had been trying to take the gun apart on the way back to Miami. They ended up and dumped the gun off a bridge into a river. And at one point in Rivera's interview, he's trying to produce a drawing to figure out where the bridge was, but they never were able to find it. Rivera said he pulled up to the bridge. Sigfredo got out, jumped the concrete and the metal rail, and then he went into some grass. He took the gun apart and tossed it. Rivera doesn't know if the gun made it to the water or not, but they could see the water from the car. He also thinks Sigfredo tossed the 3 extra bullets they had in the cylinder. Now, the one was shot into the floorboard, and then Dan was shot twice, which left those 3 bullets. He also said on this trip, they only came with 1 gun and 6 bullets. The investigators and Rivera figure it's about 25 to 30 feet from the wall into the water. He said he told Sigfredo he would have to take full responsibility for the gun if they were stopped because Sigfredo's record was cleaner than his. He said Sigfredo kept the gun with him in the passenger's seat. They drove home and never spoke about it again. They didn't tell anyone. When they got back to South Florida, they are seen on ATM surveillance video between 6:45 and 6:47 p.m. Now, from Donna's probable cause affidavit, approximately 2 hours after Sigfredo and Rivera arrived back in Miami, Katie left her home and went to Rivera's home while trying to call Sigfredo. While she was there with Sigfredo and Rivera, she did have a phone call with Charlie. When they get back to the house, Rivera was arguing with Sigfredo about them not having the money. So Sigfredo calls Katie, and she says don't worry about it. She would have it tomorrow morning, first thing before the sun comes up. Rivera told Sigfredo, I'm going to go to the barbershop in the morning, and by the time I get out, that money better be around or they're going to have problems. He told Rivera, you're making me go on a mission I didn't want to do. At Charlie's trial, Rivera said he and Sigfredo went to a bar called Big Daddy's after that. At 8:59 p.m. on the day Dan was shot, Charlie's iCloud showed a message to Charlie saying, outside your house. That would be from Donna. Later on, Katie goes to Charlie's house. She said Charlie was acting frantic. He had a gun in his hand. He was all over the place, and having a gun in his hand wasn't normal behavior. Charlie told Katie that Donna and Harvey had just left his residence and left money that Donna had washed. And when I say washed, y'all, like she legit washed the money. At Charlie's trial, Katie testified she got the money the morning after the murder. That money was in a Ziploc bag, which was inside a brown paper bag, and then there was a grocery bag over that. The money was damp and moldy, and it was stapled in $1,000 stacks. Now, Charlie, very notorious for stapling his stacks of money. Katie said a couple of days after getting the money, she opened the bag and saw there was mold on the money. So Sigfredo told her to blow dry it. But that night after the murder, Charlie gave Katie a Xanax and they fell asleep. Now, Dan's parents still lived in Canada. His dad said he wished he could have been there to hold Dan's hand as he passed. And his boys were 5 and 3 when they lost their dad. And one thing I was thinking about today, and I tweeted about this actually, is you have to wonder, I don't think Charlie really cared about where Wendi or the boys were. He was living his own life, the good life, rich, a lot of women in his life. And then to me, it's just crazy to think, did Donna think that these boys would be 3 and 5 forever? Kids grow up. They're in their teenage years now. And in fact, on one of the calls, I believe it was the hot mic call that got her busted, she mentioned that the boys didn't need her anymore, and it hurt. So she got about a year and a half of relatively stress-free time with the boys before the arrest started happening. And we're going to get to that on the last episode. It's not going to be very long. I'm not going in depth for the wiretaps or the bump or the Dolce Vita recording because I don't have time. And that's all going to come out at trial, but we will gloss over it. And again, those links are in the description if you want to go ahead and get a head start or just go explore a topic deeper than what we discussed on here. We'll end with this. Dan's funeral was on July 24th in North York, Ontario. One person notably absent from the funeral was Dan's brother-in-law, Charlie Adelson. Now, after the murders, of course, Wendi moved back to Miami, Florida, and the lowest thing I think I've ever heard in a case that was done after the murders, she changed her sons' names from Markel to Adelson. Blows my mind, especially in 2025. Would you want your boys to be known by Adelson or Markel? Hopefully when those boys get old enough, they can change their names back to their given name of Markel. Definitely a more respectful name than the ones they have now. All right, that's it for now. Hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon, and we will see you soon.